Hello, good morning to you all. Afternoon and evening. I know we are talking to people from all over the world. I'm Amanda Pinheiro, PhD student here at UCSB. We are getting ready to start, so welcome you all. We are here discussing today. It's a long name, so we can brief global anti-blackness and the racial necropolitics of COVID-19. We have four guests. We're gonna start with Professor Terrance Wooten from the Department of Black Studies at UCSB. Then we're gonna follow to Dr. Wangui Kimari, the Africa Center for Cities, University of Cape Town. Third would be Dr. Raquel Luciana de Souza, the University Federal of Bahia in Brazil, and Dr. Aurora Vergara-Figueroa, Center for African Diaspora Studies, University, Icesi, Cali, Colombia. I just would like to make two notes. The first one is since lately we are all using Zoom. I probably you all heard about the Zoom invasions, the hacker attacks. So we are not safe. We are not protected. We are trying to make sure that we are on top of the settings to trying to prevent this from happening. I hope it doesn't happen to us today, but just in case, I hope that we're going to be able. Professor Alves and I will be very trying to address that quickly. And the second point is I'm going to share with you all two links of organization in Colombia and the Department of Black Studies here at CSB, and the whole goal behind these discussions also to raise some support for the department and also for this organization. So I'm going to start with Professor Terrance, but before Professor Jaime Alves would like to talk to us a little bit. Professor Jaime, can you hear us?
Yes, hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda, for your work as well, help co-organizing this event. Thank you to the Department of Black Studies and the Center for Black Studies Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara for helping us to have this event today. Before turning the floor to my colleague, Terrance Wooten, let me very briefly situate our conversation today. The very title of our conversation, We Can't Breathe. This was a motto from the Black Lives Movement during the demonstrations in response to the killing of Eric Garner by the NYPD in 2014, as you know. Literally, from police to medical violence to broad forms of state delinquency, we can't breathe. In this case of the COVID-19, while everyone may be subjected to the virus, Black individuals are disproportionately dying everywhere. According to the New York Times, Nigeria has 164 ventilators to its 200 million people. Haiti has 64 ventilators to its 11 million. Congo has 5, and Somalia has no ventilators at all. In Brazil, Folha de São Paulo newspaper reports that 93% of favela residents are under serious food insecurity. Blacks in Brazil account for 1 of each 3 deaths by the COVID-19. While for Black people, racism has always already taken us to the COVID 2.0, COVID-20, as my dear colleague Ingrid Banks reminded me about the politically produced pandemic, the virus is devastating our Black communities even further. Our conversation here today is an attempt to make sense of this tragic moment, to imagine political solidarities, political radical responses to this old new challenge, and hopefully to build urgent responses to save lives now and to deal with the horror that is coming. So thank all of you for being here, and I open the floor to my colleague Terrance Wooten.
Hello, my name is Terrance Wooten. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Black Studies. And so a few things. One, intentionally have my background as Black Lives Matter as a sort of cogent reminder of the long-standing social movement history that has been digitized. I think there's been a conversation that's happened around what does Black protest politics look like in the age of COVID-19, where, you know, historically Black people have gotten together and marched and protests and had sit-ins, right? But then Black Lives Matter actually sort of changed in some ways. It built off of a longer politic too of thinking about alternative platforms. And so I think this moment in alignment with the historical sort of the foundations that Black Lives Matter allowed for us to do, while also reminding us of the sort of the reality of our lives. Number two is that you know, our homescapes have now become our office-scapes, have also become low-key like prison-scapes for us. And some of us have better things than others. So, you know, I have a bootleg lighting situation set up. And ignore the glare off my glasses. I can't read when I don't have my glasses. I can't see when I don't have my glasses. And then lastly, just thank you for this opportunity. As for context, I wanted to mention that we were asked to respond to a set of questions. What are the ways that what is the gender and racialized impact of the pandemic on Black communities? How has the quarantine and COVID-19 converged with enduring racial inequalities? And what has been the government's response, and what possible scenarios? So do you anticipate sort of coming down the pipeline? As a scholar who works on homelessness, what has been, particularly in the United States of America, it beyond understanding how homelessness or how the COVID-19 in the US has impacted disproportionately Black America, almost in all major cities, which is to me not surprising as a Black studies scholar, but also a sort of cogent reminder of how our lives are valued and for what. But there's also been a broad conversation about homelessness and homeless individuals or people experiencing homelessness, which has absolutely actually erased this conversation of race. What we do know in the United States of America is that 40% of the population who's homeless is Black. And that is both due to longer histories of structural inequality with redlining, reverse redlining, racially restrictive covenants, housing discriminatory practices, but also converging with histories of disability, substance and mental health abuse, and carcerality. So here in Santa Barbara County, almost an overwhelming percentage of the cases of COVID-19 cases are actually because we have a state prison. And so prisons have become, you know, these containers, both of Black life, but then also containers of Black death, ergo this question of necropolitics. And so I want to start by making a point that Mbembe makes about necropolitics, which he argues is the creation of death worlds, of new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subject to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. And so what is interesting for me is when we think about a longer history of racial capitalism and how capitalism is built off the backs of Black people, which is to say Black people were essential for capitalism to happen, as functioning as commodities, there's this conversation about who is constituted as essential or not. We are also disproportionately more essential workers, right? So we work in service industries as bus drivers. And so we then become essential for the death production. Our lives become essential for running the nation, which is to say our death is essential and predicated on the management of the nation. And this trickles into how Black folks are dying on the streets, literally from street homelessness. And the response from the state has been overwhelmingly to quarantine COVID-19 positive folks after they become COVID-19 positive, to stick them in isolated shelters. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how that process, and largely the process of death management, Black death management, has also been a process of debility management. So it really is about a sort of breaking down of death life, of disabling the Black body to then contain it and isolate it in particular ways for the nation, right? And so instead of taking homeless people and people experiencing homelessness and moving them out of shelters and into all these vacant hotels and into housing, straight into housing as a solution, which we know historically is actually works for homeless intervention, the response has been to keep everyone in shelters, which themselves are functioning more and more as carceral spaces, until they get sick, and then to isolate, which is a sort of backwards kind of logic. But then what happens is so then when folks die, they can at least die in a place that is not a shelter. So it's not actually this, and I don't read it, I read it very pessimistically, as not a sort of a mandate from the state to actually help manage the transmission of COVID-19, but actually an effort for the state to manage where it is and how publicly or not Black bodies die. Where it is that we go to die. And so there have been pushes in Seattle and San Francisco and New York City to actually dismantle shelters and to move everyone into hotels. And the state has resisted this logic, which is in effect says that homeless folks can get infected and it is okay. But again, homelessness is not a deracialized category. It is overwhelmingly Black, which is a way of saying that Black people are allowed to die from COVID-19, and that is okay. And so that has been for me sort of a sticking point, while at the same time then thinking about what this move to the digital means in terms of other kinds of economies, thinking about Black trans men and women, Black trans sex workers who with FOSTA SESTA already were having issues about the regulation of where it is and how it is that they can participate in sex work in a safe way. But now this sort of move to the digital has also often left them extremely vulnerable to death on the streets. And so I think that what this moment has shown us is a thing that a lot of us have already know, which is to say Black life is precious and it's vital, but it also is, it's constructed by the state as precarious. And in the interest of time, I want to sort of close by making a comment that I've seen a sort of dichotomy happening in public discourse about Black folks and the reasons why Black people are dying, which is on one hand to say, oh, there's this question of structural inequality, and oh, on this other hand, there's this question of the sort of pathology of Blackness and Black people not doing what's best for them. They're out here still congregating, still meeting. And I think we sometimes play into that. And I want to encourage us to be cognizant of our discourses, because this idea of the illogical Black subject who does not know what's best for themselves, instead of thinking about these ungovernable Black subjects who are actually making choices about how it is that they navigate the world and the resources that they have. I have a friend who wrote a small piece for the Boston Globe when this call to sort of make these masks came out, to wear bandanas as masks. And his question was, as a Black man, wearing a bandana into a gas station or into a grocery store, and the way in which the Black body is constructed as a criminalized body, as criminal, in fact, does this not actually put me at risk for death by the state in another way, the way that we actually know, the way in which Black Lives Matter and police brutality sort of has brought to bear, right? And so we have, I think, sometimes capitulated to this logic that says if you don't comport to the demands of the World Health Organization, of the CDC, of public health administrators, that the Black subject is somehow putting everyone else at risk, as if we are responsible for the spread of the disease. And this is definitely the discourse that's happening in Philadelphia right now. But what might it actually mean for Black people to take the conditions of their death into their own hands, to actually also be marking upon the fact that we don't have the resources that we need to have in order to negotiate and navigate the world the way that we want to, that we live in food deserts sometimes, that we don't have access to public transportation, that we don't have access to masks, and there are Black people who still do not have clean drinking water. So the idea of washing your hands itself, or they don't have running water because their utilities have been cut off. So this idea of these essential things that we are supposed to be doing to save the nation, we don't even have access to, and then we become articulated as the problem, such that then we end up structurally on the street and then get constructed as sort of the living dead or the zombified subjects who are spreading this disease known as COVID-19. And so this is the sort of concern that has been at the forefront of my mind. But that also is to say that we as scholars, as community activists, have to think about the very discourse that we use and how we might be engendering and enabling a very ableist kind of logic that actually erases the way in which the Black body is more likely to be dead, to die, and particularly the Black disabled body. And so I will end there because I'm at 11:23 and I think I did my time well. And I look forward to having the Q&A. I didn't have a structured of comments because I'm also resisting this idea of being super productive and super structured all the time in the context of a global pandemic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terrance Wooten. Would like to open the floor for Dr. Wangui Kimari. Am I pronouncing your name correctly again?
Sure, you did good, Amanda. Thank you. It's Wangui.
Wangui, okay.
So thank you all. I'm really, I feel really privileged to be here and to be sharing and trying to just support each other at this time. I'm also really hoping my internet is going to last. I've invested heavily in it today, so fingers crossed it won't be, it won't cut out. So like Terrance, I was given similar questions, and so my narrative now, I hope, attends to these questions, but I also look forward to hearing your questions after, when it's time to talk. So on this end, regionally, despite all the gloom and doom and all the Afro-pessimism and all the predictions, Africans really on the continent have not died from COVID so much. In terms of the infection rate, we have, I think as of maybe a few hours ago, like 35,000 people, a third of whom have recovered, and about 1,500 deaths. But that doesn't mean that the interventions that have come because of COVID are not jeopardizing people's lives on the continent. More locally in Kenya, we have maybe, as of today, 384 people who've been infected, 14 deaths, and maybe 100 or so people who've recovered. But what is really threatening people's existence is the mini lockdown that's come. So it's basically a lockdown, but people are still allowed to move. And the curfew that has been put in place from, it's basically a dawn to dusk curfew, so 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. This curfew has killed more people than COVID, and it's principally because of the militarization of poor people's lives. So for example, the police in implementing this curfew have killed more people than COVID. I think there was an article about a really young boy who was 13 who was killed by the police. You may have read this on CNN or in the Washington Post. Their framing of it is that it was a stray bullet. But this young 13-year-old was targeted while he was in his balcony. And these deaths happened in areas that were historically the native city. So when Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, was conceived, Africans were not allowed to live in Nairobi. Africans were only allowed into the city until if you had a pass, similar to South Africa, and here we call it the Kipande. So until about the Second World War, Africans were only allowed as migratory labor. But of course, they found places to live. And the deaths that are happening now are in these places that were historically the native city or Black. And obviously, these spaces still have, via accretion, via history, a very racialized energy, in that people who live in richer places have proximity to whiteness. But if you're in this poor, historically Black space, then your life is devalued. So people have been suffering because of extrajudicial killings. People have been drowning, running away from the police. Food costs are high. There's domestic violence has increased. People have water issues. They already had water issues for a long time, but these have against the need to have actually flowing water, not just a pipe, but actually water. the struggles are really exacerbated. And so these are the things that people are dealing with at the moment. I was going to say, but it's also the issue, for example, if in Nairobi, about 60% of the population living on 6% of the city surface area, then the high density makes it extremely hard to social distance. And so like Terrance was saying, they're illogical once again, because these poor people cannot social distance. What's their problem? So there's this consistent narrativization of them as not able to adhere to anything, ungovernable, because they're not able to social distance. But also in communities where you live in a 10 by 10 shack, I'm not sure what the measurement would be in the US, you live in a 10 by 10 shack, 6 people live in a 10 by 10 shack. Your toilet is outside, which you have to pay for. First, it's psychologically impossible and for 6 people to be in a 10 by 10 shack for months or weeks on end. But you also can't stay in your house because you don't have water in your house, you don't have a washroom in your house. So poor people are being penalized because they're not able to stay in their house. And so obviously the aftermath of this, women have to deal primarily with the aftermath of this, but they're also the principal, the agents struggling for food against its high cost of food, looking for water. Women spend inordinate amounts of time looking for water. In terms of healthcare, because COVID has taken over everything, if you only have access to healthcare in a poor health center, then you're not going to get any healthcare right now. The principal preoccupation of everyone is COVID. And so women have also died because they have gone into labor after the curfew, but they're not able to go to, they don't have the money to call an ambulance, go to a private hospital, but they're also dying because they don't have access to healthcare because of this curfew. And so these are some of the gendered ways that the situation is impacting women in Nairobi, but also people of different genders. And in terms of, the other question is, what has the government's response been? To be fair, they were responded fairly urgently when we had the first case and there was this lockdown. But there've been so many problems with this lockdown. First, it seems that Kenya is just copy pasting the interventions that Europe is doing. So there's no way we can have a lockdown because most of our workers are informal workers, at least 7% of the country informal workers without contracts. And so they're unable to go and access the daily contractual labor because of this lockdown. So part of the issue, and this is one of the outcomes of just copy pasting interventions from the US or from Europe into Kenya. Even if we agree that they responded in like fast, there's still these issues because they're not localizing what needs to happen. And then also one of the first responses from our president, who I can tell you a lot about later, and I have a lot to say about him, but not in this forum. Everyone is anticipating what he's going to say. He's the president. And one of the first interventions he announces is that Kenya, in view of COVID and that people need to work from home, Google and the Kenyan state have collaborated to give us Google Loon balloons, to give us better internet as we work from home. Everyone was really, I think it really was part of the realization. I mean, we've realized for a long time, but this government is really just for rich people. That the priority of the state was Google Loon balloons when people don't have access to food or water. So I think that announcement really emphasized that we are not able in any way to depend on this government. They've also, I mean, I don't understand how the president assumes that his nation is able to work from home, because that's not a reality for many people. There's also been a disciplinary language, and I think this is definitely a colonial legacy of Kenyans as unable to pay attention or adhere to these requirements of COVID, like Terrance was saying, or that they just don't listen. And then there's also been a lot of disaster capitalism in that if you're caught, first of all, you have to pay for your own quarantine. So if you are caught after the curfew, say at 7 p.m., and you're forcefully quarantined, you have to pay for that quarantine. And so many hotels and businesses that are linked to the government have been benefiting from the proceeds of people having to pay for forced quarantine, or if they had traveled somewhere and then they have to go into quarantine for 2 weeks, then there are businesses who are benefiting from this. And if you're poor and you're caught on the road, you don't have $20 to pay for forced quarantine for 2 weeks. So these are some of the issues. But I don't want to conclude with that bad news. And so I know that I'm just a bit over 10 minutes, but what has really been, it's given us, we say in Kenya roho imetupea moyo. What's given us spirit is the work that community organizations have been doing for their communities. Really, people have been conducting participatory services to see what gaps exist, have been raising money to give people cash transfers, because not only if you also need to pay your rent. So an amazing community organization in community I work in called Mathare has given over 150 families $20 each just to pay their rent and trying to get by. People have been supplying water to each other. They've been making soap. They've been doing amazing things, even as the threats on their lives are exacerbated. There's more legitimacy for police violence. You sometimes want to risk the curfew or working because you need to. So really, I'm really heartened by the work that communities have been doing for themselves, finding water. And even if breathing, just tying to, as I conclude to the title of this conversation, even if breathing is hard, I think in this post-COVID moment, I'm really hopeful that all these efforts to mobilize, and even mobilizing and organizing, recognizing that you can't deal with your government, I'm really hopeful that they will create more breathing space for our country. So I think Amanda, I'm over. I should stop talking, but I look forward to hearing now from Brazil and Colombia and from you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kimari. I'm going to open the floor for Dr. Raquel Souza. It's good to be able to speak Portuguese without hiding my accent. Dr. Raquel, you ready to talk to us?
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation of participating in this very much needed conversation in terms of providing us with overview of the different challenges that our communities are facing in different parts of the globe. And though there are some overlapping issues, there are also specific developments in each one of our countries and communities. And I am going to point out to some of the specificities that are affecting Brazil at the moment. And perhaps I'm going to start with the latest and most outrageous one, which is the fact that yesterday during the press conference with the current president of Brazil, whose name I refuse to mention, without cursing, the press, someone in the press asked him, so this is the current number of deaths in the country. What do you have to say about that? He said, well, what can I do about it? I am, my mid-name is Messiah, but I do not perform miracles. So needless to say, he was highly dismissive of the question, extremely disrespectful. Politicians and reporters and social community leaders are up in arms about it. But the fact of the matter is, nobody at this point wants to take responsibility for the fact that there was a number of different mechanisms and forces that led to the election of someone whose promise was to impose violence, to praise violence, and to promote death. So it's kind of ironic to me, if not actually insulting, that people, and when I say people, I'm talking about mainstream media and even right-wing politicians, those who are daring at this point to demonstrate to have some type of commitment to human life, that they dare to demonstrate to be, outraged by his response, because the main reason why he was elected on a promise, if you will, to eliminate the undesirable ones, to impose violence, to promote death. Let me repeat that again. And what better opportunity can someone like him find than a pandemic that very unfortunately is taking the lives of the most impoverished, of those who live in overcrowded communities, with not enough potable water, with no access to well-structured healthcare systems. So, today I was very upset actually to hear that he had made these comments, but I could not be moved by the fact that mainstream media is outraged by his comments, because they've supported his election. And one of the mechanisms utilized to support his election was to spend a great deal of airtime and money to demonize the Workers' Party, associating it constantly for 1 or 2 years, consistently with corruption, creating mechanisms to oust Dilma Rousseff out of power in such a way that they could replace her with her vice president, who was already committed to this type of death agenda, because the goal was to impose neoliberal policies, which meant, for example, to place a freeze in state budgets for healthcare, for public healthcare, for the educational system. And now, what do we have? We have a very underfunded public healthcare system that is facing a pandemic. And once again, very unfortunately, it is disproportionately affecting impoverished Black communities, which have already been taking the brunt of historically accumulated disadvantages. And one of the things that I have been evinced by this pandemic when it comes to our Black communities, impoverished Black communities, is the fact that begrudgingly, the federal government decided to issue a 3-month financial assistance of something around the amount of $120 monthly. And what we see is that in light of the fact that this money was issued around notions of legal citizenship, many of these people in impoverished Black communities, including informal workers, and they haven't been able to have access to this money because these notions of legal citizenship require that you must have a bank account. And if you don't have a bank account, they have created some type of virtual bank account for people, but it seems like it's not necessarily functioning. It also means that you have to have access to the internet or have a cell phone, because you're supposed to download an app in order to be able to apply for the money. And you also have to have what is the equivalent of a social security number in the United States, which is called in Brazil CPF. And many of these informal workers, or even homeless people in particular, do not have that registration number legalized. So these notions of legal citizenship, right? Even if you are just bestowing this tiny amount of financial support in order for people to not starve, since most of these informal workers depend on being out in the streets selling, you know, their goods to continue to survive, just evince many of the issues that affect us in this country. As we speak right now, as an anthropologist, I need to emphasize right now here down my window, there's this guy who's been coming here since the COVID started to spread in Bahia, asking everybody, everybody's locked down, and I hear him calling, hey auntie, hey mommy, can anybody throw me some food? Can anybody throw me 1 or 2 reais because I'm hungry? This is happening underneath my window as we speak. And this has become a reality in many places in Brazil because a lot of the homeless people who used to be able to survive on the very little amount of money or food they used to be given when people were passing by, coming to work, going to work, and going about their lives, they are now, you know, starving. They are now really, really running different types of risks aside from being contaminated. What we also see in terms of the fact that this money, this $120 monthly, 120 monthly assistance is being distributed, is that we have very long lines at the bank. And these lines, of course, go completely against what we all are being encouraged to do, which is keep social distancing, right? And when we see these long lines on TV, you are very rarely going to identify someone, a white person standing in line waiting for this money. It's all brown people standing in these long lines, in these large agglomerations of people. Though most of them are wearing masks, it's not enough to protect them from being infected, because the banks were not prepared to deal with this many people who were not even necessarily considered legal citizens prior to this pandemic, because many of them do not have this social registration number or social security number. The lines are immense, and it's heartbreaking to see that once again, while at first there were some conversations about the fact that COVID-19 was somewhat of an equalizer in times of necropolitics, because it was not something that the state could necessarily control as they control their armies and their police forces. What we see is that COVID is actually disproportionately affecting disproportionately affecting Black impoverished communities. And at the moment, you know, since I already have gone beyond my 10 minutes, this is how I would like to start this conversation in terms of discussing issues regarding necropolitics and some of the overlapping issues discussed here so far, and the specificities of the Brazilian case. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raquel Souza. I'm going to open the floor to our last panelist, Dr. Aurora Vergara. You hear me well? You ready?
Thank you for this invitation. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Jaime, Amanda, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I would like to start by sharing my screen to see if everything works perfectly. So just give me a few seconds. Amanda, it looks like you have sharing screen, so I won't be able to do that now. So I'll talk to you from my presentation while this is set up. So I'm titled, I have entitled this conversation COVID-19 and Geographies of Death in the Colombian Pacific. And I'm using this idea because I think we need to answer one of the questions that our colleagues sent. They asked us to reflect upon the ways in which COVID-19 and the quarantine converges with the enduring racial inequalities. So I'm going to organize my ideas in 3 very short moments. Amanda, have you been able to let me share the screen so that people can see the maps?
I just granted you access. I'll let you know, but keep going. I'll let you know.
Okay, excellent. So the first set of ideas is how COVID-19 looks like in Colombia. Second, relating the pandemic with the ideas of emptied territories and geographies of death. And I would like to end with a theoretical intervention, the concept of world historical empty territories and geographies of death in the world system, so that we can think about how racial inequalities, this long history of racial inequalities, now in times of COVID-19 is going to add a different layer of meaning and a different layer of oppression to lives across the globe. So I put together a general map of the world so that for people who haven't heard about this country can locate the Colombian Pacific in the region. And the second image is about the exponential growth of the cases in Colombia. So the first set of cases we have then is starting around the first 2 weeks of March, and then ever since we got so far close to 6, let me see, okay, it's up. So let me just work. You have started a screen share. Your screen sharing is possible. Okay, so I can keep on going now. So for those of you, if this is the first time that you hear about Colombia, this is the region I'm talking about, and the Colombian Pacific is located in this area. Then the cases that so we are now close to 6,000 cases. We are close to 5,959 cases. 20% of them, 21% of them recover, and 4.52 deaths so far. The cases by sex, we are close to 53 males, 53% are male, and 56% are female. And the scenario by age in Colombia is different to the one that we see in the world. So we mainly have young people. You can see this concentrated over here between 20 and 39 years old. And within Colombia, the geographical distribution, what we see now is that the cases are mainly concentrated in the Andean region, but they are starting to grow in the Pacific region. The system in Colombia does not report by ethnicity so far. And this is very interesting because they are collecting the information, but as time passes by, we'll see what is the impact for the sentence. However, we do know how it is impacting the region because we know the local systems and the local ways in which they are being impacted. There was one death of a nurse, a female nurse in the Chocó area, and her case unraveled a very complicated structural problem because the main hospital, the main public hospital in Chocó is now closed due to the increasing cases of the healthcare personnel of the hospital. That means that the entire state is now under extreme vulnerability because the main public hospital is closed. The female nurse that died a few days ago was taken to one of the private hospitals, and the carriers refused to reveal the cause of her death. So now this main hospital, this public private hospital, is also facing probably the closing of it due to the mismanagement of the body of this nurse. So with this general overview of the country, I would like to go into the second session of my reflections, is considering the idea of this concept of emptied territories and geographies of death. So COVID-19 is not coming into a vacuum. It's not a pandemic that comes to join a society that is equal. Our colleagues have already addressed this point, and I would like to consider a few ideas. Jaime Alves and Joao Vargas, they say that they use this concept of geography of death to investigate the multi-layer aspect of state-sanctioned and lethal violence perpetrated by, but not limited to, the police force. This entails a consideration of at least 3 types of factors: actual violent acts. So in the Pacific, the armed groups are still killing a lot of people while in quarantine. Many social leaders have been killed while in quarantine. This is also considering their symbolic dimensions and the historical and structural conditions within which violence emerges. And I would also call Mbembes, as Tara said at the beginning, this idea that the
Don Tree Duckray has joined.
This concept of Mbembe, the ultimate expression of sovereignty, resides to a large degree in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. And I would like us to consider that the neglect of the governments across the globe in the African diaspora is, in fact, evidence of racism. So empty territories, I believe, are social geohistorical formations that need to be understood within the context in which they are conceived, produced, live, reproduced, and unproduced. So these uncertain times start to reveal the intricate power of the intersection between people, their territories, and their specific vulnerabilities that they face. And we already heard from the United States, Kenya, and Brazil. So people of the Colombian Pacific constantly are facing death, contrary to spaces that are designed for enjoyment. So to live a life of dignity, these territories and this region have not been conceived as such. On the contrary, they have been kept as—
Diana Collins.
I propose that we should consider that most of our territories have been kept as laboratories of death. And what I heard from my colleagues around the globe, we can see that each of our territories, each of these Black territories are being kept as laboratories of death. So this is an image of the Chocó area where most of the work that we are conducting is taking place. And this image helps me to illustrate this idea of the empty territories, because at the same time that many million people are living there, this is how most people imagine these territories. Finally, the theoretical intervention that I would like to contribute to this conversation is that COVID-19, we can consider this pandemic in relation to this concept of the world historical empty territories and geographies of death in the world system. And what I mean by this is that world historical and empty territories can help us to, this concept can help us as an analytical tool, a world historical analysis, to comprehend how the configuration of territories
Diana Sanchez has
where conquest, exploitation, violence, deracination happen at the same time that many politics of development and contestation for liberation are happening. So this is coexistent with many instances of resistance, but at the same time, this is covered by a mantle of narratives of underdevelopment, marginality, and barbarity. Regions such as the Colombian Pacific, which have been represented economically as poor,
Damer Alexis
racially as Black and Indigenous, and along the gender lines as virgin territories, politically and socially and culturally as backward, face specific vulnerabilities that we must address, and that we need to press our governments to consider this differentially. The concept of historical empty territories could contribute to comprehend the specific challenges that COVID-19 adds to these historical systems of oppression. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aurora Vergara. We're gonna just let Professor Jaime Alves to bring a note for us, and we're gonna open for the Q&A right after. Just a second, let me just.
Hello?
Jaime, yes, can you please repeat?
Yes, thank you. In the spirit of all these interventions asking for urgent actions, I would invite all of you to take a look at our campaign. This is the campaign from Cali, Colombia, in which communities have been launched this campaign asking for donation from people around the world to support at least 100 families that are in really risky situations in Colombia. This one, I hope you are seeing there in the screen. Let me see if I can disable this one and
you are able to share. See if you can share.
Oh, I thought it was already. Is it sharing already? No?
No, not yet.
It was showing for a few minutes.
Okay, so this one, I'm gonna put the link for donation. If people are able to donate, I'm gonna put the link in the chat. This is one campaign, and the other campaign I'm gonna just show here very quickly is that one here in Brazil. We also have this campaign Brazil in which UniAfro Brazil are trying to collect money to support at least 30 communities in the favelas of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And as for so I'm gonna put also the link there if people feel they can help with any amount, that will be greatly appreciated. And yeah, that is it. I will put both of them over there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Professor Jaime. Amparo, now we're gonna open for Q&A. So we have around another hour to talk. So let's do this way. I'm gonna ask you to place your questions, or if you want to, want the floor to make an intervention, just please add your name here in the chat, and Professor Alves will organize the list. So if you have questions for our panelists, or if you want to make some comments, just please add your name to the chat, and we're gonna organize the order, and I'll open the mic for you to talk whenever you're ready, okay? So please feel free to just let us know if you have a question or comment, and we're gonna open. So I have an Ethan. So let me just try to find Ethan here. We have right now 104 participants. So Ethan, you hear us?
Yeah.
All
Hello.
right.
I have a question for Aurora. So she said that these empty territories can be considered as laboratories of death. I'm just curious if you can explain that, the laboratory part a bit more. Because when I hear the word laboratory, I think about kind of a clinical aspect of treatment, a form of experimentation, a dehumanization. But I'm not 100% exactly sure what you mean by laboratories of death. Is it like the government is experimenting on people, or is it a different way? So yeah, thank you.
Can we collect some of the informations, some of the questions, like 5 questions?
Thank you,
Give
Ethan.
up to you. Okay, it seems like people are still thinking, Aurora, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you, Ethan, for your question. And that's an excellent point. I started using that idea because one of the main generals of the army here in Colombia a few years ago said that they were going to deploy close to 300 military personnel to the Chocó area. And he said that that was going to be an experiment, a social laboratory, that Chocó was a social laboratory for how their action against guerrilla members was going to act. And he said that very openly. He said that Chocó had everything to experiment on. So we have many armed groups operating in the territory. And at the same time, the state of Chocó has the highest concentration of minerals and natural resources to contribute to the development of the nation. So the vast majority of the population of the state of Chocó live in extreme poverty, while we have extreme natural resources to contribute to the nation. So while I was conducting my ethnography about a massacre that occurred in Bahia, Chocó, I crossed upon that interview and I decided to start using the idea of the laboratory of death because it was now an official statement of the government saying that they were going to experiment on the territory to see if they could use these war techniques in other regions of the country. So what I see now is that while we have great resources, we are also having several ways in which people are dying from diseases, from a lack of food, lack of healthcare, and now we have COVID-19 adding a layer of meaning to that. So that's what I mean by laboratory of death. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
And can I add also to this point, as a reminder as well, that you had the World Health Organization director who had to condemn French doctors for suggesting trying out COVID-19 medicine on the continent of Africa, right? And so there's actually a sort of larger history of Black bodies being the bodies in which new drugs and medication are experimented on. And so in that way, and then if you even think about in the US context, this idea of, injecting disinfectants, et cetera, and the president sort of just articulating all these various different things that we could be using, the medication for malaria, for instance. Like Black people were dying from using a medication that the president was encouraging people to use. And so in that way, so too has the population become sort of the Black population globally has become understood as bodies that we can test medication out on, that we can test policy out on, that we can test all like programs out on. And so that way it adds to, in a sort of more global way, but certainly specifically in the US, these things are happening too. And so, and there's a larger history as well happening there. So I really appreciate this idea of a laboratory of death because it is a sort of the experimentation of on Black life.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I can also add something. Thanks so much, Terrance, for bringing that up because in Kenya, there's been real outcry about the possibility of the COVID drug being tested here because it really, Africans are the guinea pigs for everything. Currently, we've been the guinea pigs for HIV trials, for even birth control that is then put on the market in the US, gynecological innovations, heart surgery, so all of these things. So I also really appreciate Aurora's conceptualizing this as a laboratory of death. But even despite all of these protests, the President Kagame in Rwanda, I think, has agreed that Rwandese bodies can be used to test the COVID-19 vaccine. So this is something people are still contesting, but again, like you, I also appreciate Aurora's defining this as a laboratory of death.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Excellent. I have two questions here. I'm gonna open for Mark. Mark, let me just find you. And Mike, you there? Okay, go ahead, you have the floor.
Yeah, hi, does everyone hear me? Well, first of all, I can't thank you all enough for organizing this. I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, working in the Middle East and also in Africa, in Kenya and Nigeria and in Chiapas, it becomes clear, I think we're all seeing the same issues about social death or geographies of death or just this kind of necropolitics increasingly on steroids. And what I started to fear, the second Trump announced he was ending immigration, which is now a little bit hazy what he's doing, but I don't think it really matters what's actually happening. The discourse around saying America is now closed to anyone from the outside, and unless you're just a seasonal worker, is really the first step in a kind of American final solution to minorities and other so-called undesirables or people who don't fit into an emerging new kind of neoliberalism where there's so many surplus workers who just the economy doesn't need them, that these kind of pandemics, as several people mentioned, are opportunities to actually to get rid of a lot of people. And I'm wondering how we can conceptualize this, and more importantly, in a praxic perspective, how does this mobilize people to take the kind of direct action that needs to be taken to stop this before it just becomes the reality and people just don't even bother fighting it structurally anymore. They're just too busy trying to survive. I think we need a way to describe it. And I think the words people are using, geographies of death, going back even to Lenin, social death, these are all great terms, but somehow we need a narrative that's universal, that can really be opposed to the kind of nationalist, racialized narratives that are so prevalent everywhere. And I'm not sure how to do that, but I would imagine this is something where we as scholars, who are most of us activists, can play an important role. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Who would like to respond to Mark?
Amanda, just to add to Mark's intervention, I would like also to provoke my colleagues to think with us which scenario you imagine for the post-coronavirus. I think it's follow Mark's point, because we have all these very optimistic conversations on internet that, the pandemic is gonna shape the world. The world's never gonna be the same again. We have different ways that we're gonna deal with nature, with human beings. The hegemony of empire is under question, but you have this delinquency of the empire. Trump kidnapping airplanes with ventilators to other countries. You have all these European countries with more and more anxiety about borders. So it seems like that the bright future that the people are imagining in the post-pandemic, it doesn't apply for Black people. So it would be good to hear your thoughts about the future, the post-pandemic moment.
All right.
Can I try to address that? Because as a matter of fact, Jaime and I have had many debates around this particular issue. And I think that one of the personal debates, and I think that one of the things that we all need to consider is, how are we, or the people who are committed to social justice, racial equality, reparations, or whatever terminology we would like to use here, going to take advantage of this particular moment in which, for what is worth, COVID-19 is exacerbating and evincing social economic inequalities, social economic racial disparities, the the vulture-like nature, if you will, of empire. If we would like to mention the example that Jaime has just brought up, which is the fact that airplanes have been, kidnapped, if you will, or seized. In order to prevent that other countries get the equipment they needed. How are social movements, left-wing parties, whatever is left of them, going to reorganize themselves because the opportunity is here? Many of the issues that we had been debating and researching about and publishing were just not necessarily getting the visibility that COVID-19 is providing us with. The fact that we have Black communities, even in the United States, taking the larger brunt of this pandemic because of what they call comorbidities, or an accumulation of health issues. And the fact that in Brazil, for example, it's now becoming extremely clear that a sociopath was elected to become president. I mean, how are we going to take advantage of this particular moment? Because it's not necessarily just that spiritual forces are going to come and bring harmony to the world and bring social economic equality and whatnot. It is up to us, those who are committed to social economic equality and fairness, and to reorganize around this particular moment that this tragic pandemic is providing us. How are we going to change our strategies? Are left-wing parties going to be able to seize upon this particular moment in which we have so many of the issues that we were already arguing for or against being, again, let me repeat that, exacerbated and evinced? How are we going to reorganize ourselves? It's a matter of really thinking about new strategies, new developments, new frameworks, if we are talking about the academic aspect of this, new ways of establishing or reestablishing a dialogue with impoverished communities in Brazil, for example, which is something that very unfortunately the Workers' Party kind of lost contact with these communities, right? How are we going to establish are we going to continue to trust in democratic processes, as processes that are actually going to be able to put in power people who are committed to debunking, to fighting, dismantling neoliberalism, or replacing necropolitics with something that is actually going to promote life? This is the question, in my opinion.
Thanks, Raquel. I'm gonna just add to what you just saying, speaking of dialogue and action. Mayra Alzate has a question. Mayra is asking what do you think about the power of the Latino vote in this, upcoming new configuration of politics in the US? And I think we can talk about new configuration of politics in other parts of the world too, especially in Latin America. But I'd like to hear those comments about the power of Latino vote, Latinos in general, in terms of community activism, action, dialogue, in this scenario that we have right in front of us.
Could I say something to that?
Let me see, anybody else? Just because Mark already had an intervention.
Yeah, I know.
Nobody?
I didn't know if it was addressed.
No, that's okay. All right. Go ahead, Mark.
I just want to say, I think, the group that went hardest for Bernie Sanders, it seems, across demographics was Latinos in the US, more than even African Americans. So I think it says something about their commitment to a politics outside of the normal two-party, Democratic or even Republican establishment. And that was really exciting at least for me as someone who, was involved in the DSA and in Bernie's, supporting Bernie's campaign. The question is, I think, how does it get mobilized now? Because Biden, that was now ripped away from them, right? So now it's Biden, and who knows if people can be mobilized by him, this whatever all his other issues, just in terms of the loss of that connection that Sanders had to that community, which was kind of unique considering he wasn't from a traditionally Latinx state. Vermont's actually a very white state, but he had a lot of connections and resonance. So I think it's a great thing, but I think it comes to my question, which is, what is the electoral, in terms of forming strategies? There are some countries where we can form electoral strategies to try to push back, and others where where there's not even an electoral democracy to speak of to do that. And I think the U.S. is starting to become closer to the latter. So that would seem to be something we need to attenuate as we think about it.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions lined up here. So the first one, it goes by the name of Dayon. Dayon, are you there?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you. Okay, so I have a question for Dr. Wooten. And so Dr. Wooten, you're talking about the ways in which Black people are disadvantaged in the face of the global pandemic, and how Black people or certain Black communities still don't have clean drinking water. So the idea of washing your hands is kind of irrelevant, and how Black people are criminalized for wearing face masks, which is a recommendation by the CDC. And also how Black people are sacrificed in the face of the pandemic, and how the homeless population is neglected, and how a huge portion of essential workers are Black. And I was wondering how that relates to the protest we see today, and how kind of like the hypocrisy in it, and how we have people who are protesting saying like they want haircuts, and saying like they want to get back out there, they don't want to be told what to do. And this protest is kind of emboldened by the president, it's emboldened by like right politicians. Yet when we have protesters for police brutality, that protest is immediately met with like narratives from the media that, oh, these are rioters, these are thugs, these are people playing the race card, and how that's like very and these protests are met with literal military equipment, tear gas, arrest. And so I'm wondering, in like a more simpler frame of my question, I'm wondering, what does the outbreak in this country show us about protest? And I'm wondering, is it more about like rather what people are protesting about, and more about who is protesting? Because we have people who are asking for haircuts, emboldened by the president, and people who are saying, look, we don't want to get killed by the police, and these people are met so negatively and with such excessive force. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer your question by not answering it in the way that you framed it, and I apologize. Because I think actually what you're pointing out and what I'm hinting at, and I think this gets to this conversation about politics in terms of electoral politics, is not necessarily what this means about protest as a category, but what this is actually demonstrating about democracy as a category and nationalism, right? And so who gets to become a part of democracy, on whose body is democracy forged, who is understood to be constitutive of and a citizen of democracy in the way that the category of citizenship sort of reinforces these nation state boundaries, which then require a kind of nationalist politic that forges on the geopolitical boundaries of empire, that now has nations literally receding into themselves to shut down their borders, to block out quote unquote outsiders. That I think it's showing us that, and I have a lot of feelings about a lot of things, but I think it's showing us that democracy doesn't really doesn't work for Black people. That democracy has not really actually worked for Black people, and it wasn't designed for Black people. And if we start from that positionality, then we can also start from a positionality that maybe electoral politics is not designed for and thus does not work for Black people. And that we have to start to imagine kinds of interventions, which has been a long history of Black radical politics and Black radical tradition of imagining kinds of modes of conviviality, of desire, of being, of belonging that actually aren't sutured to the nation state. Because to suture our identity and our belonging to the nation state is to actually reinforce the very nation state that then kills Black people globally, right? And so there's something about how we have to, I think, I think we have been, apropos to Black Lives Matter, have been thinking about protest politics in a different way to actually call out structural equality, and not necessarily protest politics as being about belonging to the nation state through democratic participation, which is not to say that I don't think inherently democratic participation is cannot be a tool per se, but I'm really, really wary of us sort of couching our freedom, couching our humanity, couching our livelihood in democracy, because we actually know that democracy doesn't work, and democracy has been used as a tool of empire to dominate and dispossess Black bodies and Black spaces and Black geographies. And so I think more than anything, this is an opportunity to start to continue, because this is part of the Black radical tradition and Black radical imagination, to continue to start to imagine life worlds that ways of being connected that don't require a mitigation with the nation, that we can connect across this question of Blackness. And Blackness not just being about abjection and deficit, but actually about being sort of these, all these ways that we share, histories that we share. I don't want to do like the negative versus positive, but I do think we get really inundated in this question about Blackness is always being, well, you're Black if you're going to get killed by the police, right? But there are also a whole bunch of other things that constitute the joy and the vitality and the brightness of Blackness that is not just about our disposability to death. And so reminding ourselves of that too, right? Like this idea, like, yes, we can't breathe, but we're still doing it. Like we were, in the US, we came as chattel slaves, right? So there's like not a sort of, and this idea of like, this is all impossible post COVID-19, like our worlds end because we're just gonna be continuously killed. Like if we sat at that logic, we would not be where we are today, because Black people have always known that we were more than what empire constructed us to be, that we had a history before empire. And I think tapping into that more now than ever is important for our sustenance. And I think the kinds of mutual aid funds and grassroots organizing that Dr. Alves is pointing to is, I think, the entry point as a participation in a protest politics that does not look like an alignment with the nation state.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have 4 questions here, and so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to either let people ask the questions, or I'm going to ask a few questions that I have too, and then we open and send back to our panelists, okay? Jaime, what do you think?
Yes, that's good.
All right, so I'm going to start with Jay's question. So Jay is saying, after listening to you all, the amazing speakers, it sounded like more Black African people are dying from the repercussions of the COVID-19 rather than the virus itself. Do you all think that comments like the Surgeon General Jerome Adams, that if it has an impact on the stigmatization of the Black body, and do you all feel like there is misinformation being spread on the true effects of COVID on the Black African body? So just to give some feedback, some background on Jay's question. So Jerome Adams, during one of the press conferences, said that Latinos, he said Hispanics and African Americans should take it easy on alcohol and drugs, because he was discussing on the numbers, and he was saying, well, we should all be careful, especially these 2 groups, basically take it easy on alcohol and drugs. So the next question is Lena. I'm gonna open for Lena to ask her question. Lena, you ready? Can I let you? Where is Lena?
Maybe we can read her question.
Okay, should I read the question? Okay,
Yeah.
so let me just go back here and find Lena's question. Lena, should I read your question or you want to ask a question yourself?
Yeah. Still says she has problem with the internet connection.
Yeah, okay. So let's just do it. Jaime, could you please find her question? And meanwhile, I'm gonna find, I have another question here from Alisa. Alisa, I'm gonna open the floor for you. Alisa was right here. Let me find you, Alisa.
Hi.
Hi, Alisa, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you all for sharing. It was a really great discussion. So I wanted to kind of work off of what Dr. Wooten had said about imagining these life worlds in which Black lives are actually considered. So my question was kind of, in that life world that we can imagine, I see a post-pandemic existence being very different from the current circumstance we're in with capitalism, globalism, all those things that we can no longer consider ourselves existing or mediating in, like Dr. Wooten said. So I guess my question is, how do we develop life worlds that are more considering of anti-capitalist or anti-global practices? Since we obviously have existed prior to all of those structures and systems. I personally am really interested in different spiritual practices that are very relevant to those anti-capitalist forms of existing. So I guess my question is, how do y'all imagine that life world?
Thanks, Alisa. I'm going to read Lena's question. Could we understand the laboratory of death proposed by Aurora as the lack of attention that our people are experiencing now as well? I mean, could we approach the conceptualization of laboratory as a set of social interventions, but also as non-intervention in Kenya, Brazil, and the US? So we have these three questions and we're gonna open to our panelists to discuss. Sounds good? Should we start with Dr. Kimari?
Thank you. I am going to talk. I'm not sure all questions relate to me, but I've seen one from Ethan that I was thinking about as well. And I know there's a question about what can we do to make the post-COVID world more generous? First, it was interesting for us being here because the moment the pandemics became a pandemic, everyone was predicting lots of African bodies on the streets. And we were also scared because we know, like Jaime was saying, we don't have enough hospitals, we don't have enough water. But it's an interesting response to that was also the security briefings circulating amongst diplomatic bases here. So people are also imagining that Africans are going to riot and everyone from Europe needs to be repatriated there. But none of this has come to be. So I think for us, we're still thinking about that. But we're also, it's giving us pause, time to reflect also because, for example, many people are mobilizing to try and reorganize an economy, but this is hard to do when our trade unions are co-opted. And when we have, for sure, Africans who are also very committed to capitalism. But these are things that people want to do. And for sure, our government has not responded in a somewhat welfare approach, like that's being seen in Germany, perhaps in the US. And for us, that's really also emphasized that the government is not providing water for people if it hasn't provided like food for people at risk consistently, then this is just a government for the rich. I also wanted to say that Africa, and I'm sure everyone, there's so much literature on this, but Africa is said to be having a bromance with China. And Ethan was asking this, and we've seen that various things have, even if many people are critical of this supposed win-win relationship or how it's framed as equal and not racialized, I think more people, even in the mainstream press, are critical of it now, seeing how Africans in China were evicted from their houses because they were supposedly carriers of the disease and they were sleeping on the street. And also, especially against this emphasis by the Chinese embassy here, but broadly, that the relationship with Africa is a relationship of solidarity, and it's good because Africa should then turn away from the West that colonized it. And we are, of course, brothers in arms. So these situations also give people like much needed reflection on this China-Africa relationship that's always framed as non-racial and as win-win. Also because masks that our government had bought were also, just like Trump is recalling ventilators, masks that we bought from China were recalled. And that also for Kenyans really emphasizes that obviously, even to our own government, our bodies don't matter if China can say all of a sudden masks are recalled. But in terms of what does a post-COVID world look like, I think, and I hope, and also related to this discussion, here on the continent, we've really been struck by the disproportionate amount of Black bodies dying because of COVID in the US. And I think for us, it really offers an opportunity to think about, and we should have been thinking about this a long time ago, but why is this happening? What makes Africans in the US, in Europe, more susceptible to death? And what possibilities exist to think this together, to work through it together? And I think as part of a hopefully more generous post-COVID world where labor is reorganized to sustain people, we can also think about what solidarity do we need to enact from here to Africans abroad to try and think through and work through and heal from how COVID is COVID is killing so many Africans abroad. So that's all. Thank you.
I would like to say a couple of things about the question. Can you all hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
The question posed by Lukumi, I think her name is Lina Lukumi, when it comes to this concept presented by Aurora, right? The laboratory of death, in terms of a perspective of no state or public authority intervention in our communities. And I think that if I am able to share an image with you here, please. The image of the cover, can you see it? The cover of a newspaper in my state that brings the number of deaths, of casualties so far in Brazil. And I would actually like to emphasize that one of the strategies that the state and the federal government has been utilizing in Brazil is to underreport on COVID deaths cases, okay? So a lot of the people who are dying of COVID are actually receiving a death certificate stating that they have experienced serious respiratory issues, because underreporting is one of the strategies utilized by state authorities to not evince the fact that Brazil has also become a death laboratory, Aurora. And this is how I would like to address Lina's question, because as I stated in the beginning of my presentation, here we have verbatim the code of what the president stated yesterday in response to a reporter. He said, yes, there are 5,017 people dead so far. So what was his answer? I'm sorry. What would you like me to do? I am a Messiah because his second name is Messiah, but I don't perform miracles. So he's basically very publicly, to use a Christian reference, a Catholic reference, washing his hands and taking no responsibility for these deaths. Because if we were to really think about his position, his take, at least so far on this pandemic, while the president of the United States sarcastically, quotation, quote unquote, proposed that people could inject disinfectants in their veins or use ultraviolet light to cleanse their bodies from the virus, here the president not only made this statement yesterday, but he also fired, maybe a week ago or so, the Minister of Health. And one of his arguments to fire him is that the former health minister was too focused on life rather than the economic stability of the country. So when we have someone at the federal government who is committed to just disregarding human life to the extent that he makes this public declaration, starting by, so what if people are dying? And I actually fires the Minister of Health that was emphasizing and stressing the importance of social distancing on going on TV every day to provide the public with accurate information and emphasizing social distancing. I think that it's fair, unfortunately, to state that Brazil also has become a laboratory of death. And what saddens me tremendously is that in all of these countries that we have talked about here, who are we going to report these people to? Who are we going to appeal to? Who is going to come to our rescue? And that's the question that is pressing all of us at the moment, because in a context where we have neoliberal policies in place, which means the state is not supposed to intervene, and many politicians throughout the globe have been elected on this type of political platform or promise, how are we going to now press these types of politicians to overturn these policies, to revisit their thinking, particularly because very unfortunately COVID is disproportionately affecting the so-called undesirable sectors or majority undesirable sectors of the population. That's the question that, unfortunately, for now at least, I don't think we have any real concrete positive answers in sight.
Thanks, Raquel. I'm gonna go back to Aurora and also Terrance and ask if they have comments on this round of questions. And after that, I'll open the next round of questions.
No, I think so. Just Ethan had asked the question about how the discouragement might affect Asian-Black relations in the U.S. And I think for me, what I think is an interesting project that is happening now is there are sort of debates about what is the role of Black people in fighting race, doing this anti-racist work on behalf of Asian Americans, which I think is a complicated, because there is a complicated history there of on one hand, cross-coalitional politics, but on the other hand, so these histories of anti-Blackness that also emerge amongst Asian descendant populations as well, as a sort of a way to belong to the nation state, which is why I'm sort of critical of belonging to the nation state. But I think more so useful of a framework is to ask, how do we collectively do anti-racist work in a structural way? And how do we do anti-racist work in a structural way that centers the experiences of Black people, which is that is my interest, right? And because from my positionality, if we do anti-racist work, which for me, anti-racist work is also anti-ableist work, it's also anti-transphobic work, it's also anti-patriarchal work, it's also anti-capitalist work. Like, it has to be all of these things, because that is how anti-Blackness functions, right? So if we are to do that work, in my approximation, everyone wins. And so it's not, I think, yes, it's useful in some ways to think about Asian American, Black American relations, but I think it's might be more useful to us to think about what is our relationship to power, and how can we mobilize our power to get collectively across these categories of difference to actually destabilize how structural inequality is happening. And I see those kinds of conversations, those are historical conversations that have always happened, but I think now more than ever, perhaps demonstrative of, if you even look at the call itself, we are starting to really push that kind of question of, like, how do we, where is power, who has power, what is our relationship to power, how do we dismantle systems of oppression, and always thinking about systems and structures. And if we're not doing that work, then I'm always sort of curious about where does that go, which is not then to say that community-based self-care work is not important work, and that is not a part of this anti-institutional, anti-systemic inequality, but that certainly that is the kind of eye that we have. But I also think it challenges our notion of this multicultural neoliberalism, that we're all quote unquote people of color, and on that basis we're all the same and we're all positioned the same way to power. It actually sees that we can really deeply be invested through the category of color in anti-Blackness. You can be deeply invested through the category of color in oppression, because of the way that we get so connected to, and this is Dion's point about sort of protest politics, it's a rights-based discourse. Like, we have the right to do these things because liberalism confers these rights to us. And I think that's sort of why we have to really stop and ask ourselves to challenge these fundamental notions of how we organize our life and our life worlds, because it's not in service necessarily to us and to where we want to go. And so I think that that is a kind of challenge that these relations have demonstrated. And again, this is not the first time this has happened, where really we've gotten to the point where we have internalized this discourse we have accepted this discourse of multiculturalism, and we're all in this together, without actually acknowledging that we are in this system, sure, but differentially positioned. And some of us as such are invested in the very thing that we imagine ourselves to be critiquing, and we have to be really cognizant of that.
Thanks so much. Terrance, we're gonna now, I have two more questions. That's part of the next round. And then I'm gonna go back to our panelists, and we're gonna do our closing remarks. So the first question is from, I'm gonna just read her name. It's Kay Stringer Stanback. So she's asking, what does the labor movement look like worldwide? How do we work to organize? It's pretty much related to what Professor Terrance just said. And now I'm gonna open for Tamara Marcus. Tamara, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So my question goes to Aurora, Professor Aurora and Professor Raquel. It has a lot to do with what Lina Lucumis asked. I wanted to know, regarding the concept of laboratory of death, if we can relate this, the choice of not acting in terms of like the government choosing not to act upon a certain situation and upon a certain territory. For example, what refugee camps have been like in Europe regarding dehumanization, and also the favelas in Rio, for example, in Brazil in general, but my experience with Rio de Janeiro. like lack of basic things, like lack of running water? Isn't this like some sort of violence that we could consider as a laboratory of death? Has to speak.
All right, so I'm gonna just go back to our panelists. So that's our last round with 2 questions. We have Tamara question and the question that I just read for you all. Who would like to comment on that?
Can I?
Yes, please, Raquel.
Yes, I'll be brief because I don't want to repeat myself, but just reiterating what I said in the beginning, the fact that COVID is now striking, that we are now enduring, living, dealing with the challenges brought upon us by COVID-19, is just serving to exacerbate in events what was already set up as a laboratory of death. And I think that's actually what Aurora was saying, because Professor Aurora, I can't remember exactly what the date was when this statement or this concept was, framed, this notion that, the state was going to experiment upon these particular territories. And COVID-19 is just exacerbating and advancing this process. Because if we were to mention, for example, the context of the United States and Brazil, we have 2 presidents that were elected in spite of being openly sexist, homophobic, racist, classist, and committed to killing. I mean, if we were to think about the fact that we had immigrants being put in cages in the United States, and as far as I know, thousands of them remain there, and they do not receive any type of appropriate health care or support and what have you, mothers separated from their children, fathers separating from their wives, and so on and so forth, the dismantlement of families. Similar situations were taking place in Brazil, in which police brutality was rampant, even in states that were governed by the so-called left-wing parties. I think this laboratory of death has just been very unfortunately exacerbated by COVID-19. And yes, we could very much say that, as Luni, I think her name is, Lukumi had proposed, had suggested, the carelessness or the disregard for particular sectors of historical marginalized communities globally is a laboratory of death. I would like to actually thank Professor Aurora for bringing up this concept, because it allows us to put it in context, in the broader concept of, a world in which necropolitics is the framework, right? Walking hand in hand, being employed hand in hand with neoliberal policies. I don't know necessarily where we go from here, but the only way I could think of, and it's not even something that I have actually addressed before, I'm not necessarily a very big fan of Afrofuturism, but I think it's an interesting possibility here. I would like to envision a globalized universe in which we could have, an intergalactical tribunal in which the so-called more advanced civilizations could gather up somewhere or here on Earth to judge the fact that we are living under circumstances where we have people in charge of large portions of population on a global scale who are basically leaving these communities to die at their own devices. That's the only possible scenario I can envision in this particular context, because again, who are we going to recur to? Where are we going to go to ask for help? Where? Who is going to support us? Judicial systems, for example, in Brazil, and as far as I know in the United States, are just sitting down and watching these developments without interference. Who are we going to who is going to support us in this particular context in which historically marginalized populations are dying at the moment at a very rapid pace? So that's how I would like to conclude my participation. Once again, thank you very much for the invitation, Professor Jami Alves, and I look forward to future conversations about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So I'd like then to ask the other panelists for their closing remarks. Professor Vergara, you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you for your reflections. Thank you for your question. Tamara, thank you for your question. I definitely think neglect and non-intervention is a manifestation of racism. And I would like to highlight that when governments are confronted with Black pain, with Afro-descendants, Africans, Black around the globe, manifesting their pain and their grief, and when they respond with silence, they are letting die people. They are allowing people to die. So definitely I do believe that the lack of answer, neglect, carelessness is a strategy to let people die, is a strategy to reinforce racism, and as a consequence to continue perpetuating the impacts of structural racism. In Colombia, we have the case of Chocó. For several weeks, the government and the general public, they were saying Black people don't get COVID, so everybody just chill. Others were saying, no, the COVID is not going to go.
Jamie Alves has started.
Others were saying that COVID was not going to manifest in the state of Chocó because it was too far away to get there. And what we see now is that mainly healthcare workers have the disease, and now we have this space completely closed and open for a disaster. So I definitely think we should start pressing this idea, because sometimes governments will argue that by not saying anything, they are not necessarily being racist, or that they are necessarily not reinforcing death, but they are doing it. Not answering is a form of racism, and they are reinforcing laboratories of death. I want to thank you for your questions, your reflections, the way in which you are thinking through this idea, because by living in the conditions of many of the people I have been working with while conducting ethnography, is that I have come to understand the power of this idea of letting people die, or the power of this idea of designing territories only for exploitation and for letting Black people die. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Jaime. I thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Other panelists? No? So, Dr. Kimari, you ready?
Sure, thank you. I also just want to say thank you. I'm really glad to be able to share and hear and engage with you all. In our country, sometimes, the strangest things happen. For example, even if Kenyan airspace is closed and has been closed for a month, and the government has refused to pick up stranded Kenyans in China and other places, our government sent about maybe 3,000 bouquets of flowers to UK healthcare workers. So this just shows you the kind of priorities it has. And this came to my mind when I kept hearing, as I heard people say that we've been let to die. But I just, in conclusion, despite all of these things, even if we've been let to die, I don't think we're going to support being let to die. And that gives me a lot of hope. And part of that not letting die is this discussion. So I'm really grateful to be part of this. And I I send lots of energy from Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wooten?
Yeah, so that exact point is the point that I'm walking away with, right? Is that while we, so I also appreciate the framing of this, because it wasn't just sitting around and sort of diagnosing how we are dying and the fact that we are dying, but also thinking about ways to respond to these forms of death making for us, and both in this sort of creation of community, of intellectual community and dialogue in the form of contributing. Dr. Alves has continuously put in resources in the comments, and then I had suggested a book on a history of Black cooperatives. And so I'm going to encourage folks to, in your local community, right? Like the global is also local and local is global. There's a connection there. Look to mutual aid funds. Look to what's happening on your campus. For those of you who are at UCSB, the graduate students who are on strike have created a mutual aid fund for undergraduates. There have been calls for rent strikes, for tuition strikes across campuses in response to COVID-19. And so there are a number of ways that we can sit and wait to be killed. And there are a number of ways that we are asked often to wait on life-sustaining resources. But if there's anything about Black people, is that we also don't just, that's not what we do. We don't just sit around and wait. We make demands, we create, we imagine, we do otherwise for each other. And so I think at a basic level, I'm going to encourage folks to check in with each other, check in on each other. At a higher level, look into opportunities to actually invest in local movements, grassroots organizations, start to build your own cooperatives and collectives. We can't, and this way, what we do know historically is we can't actually wait on the state to care about us. We can demand and insist that we are here, that we matter, and we can pressure the state to honor those demands, but we also have to model something else with and for each other. And so for me, this was a great opportunity. I think we can all say that we sit on Zoom for very long times. My lower back, I'm only so old, but my lower back is a different age these days. But this was, for me, this was actually, these are the types of sort of sustaining, life-sustaining things that help me get through the day and get through chaos and get through pandemic. And we have to remind ourselves that, there is, the future that we have for ourselves is one that we're willing to create. And we have the tools and resources to do them, but we just have to share. And so I thank you for organizing this. I appreciate all of my beautiful, wonderful, and intelligent, low-key, more prepared panelists. And that we always have to be mindful of the global nature of anti-Blackness. Like we cannot afford to actually rest on the parochial. So even as I'm saying, please look to, you can look to your local community as a starting point. Also, don't lose sight of the global, because when we lose sight of the global, we actually could be participating in the creation of the very problem that we think that we're dismantling. And so this has been a lovely forum. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort. Amanda, thank you for moderating. And yeah, my day has a new life and new joy.
Thank you so much. Professor Alves.
Everybody, to thank you. And I would also close to thank Amanda Pinheiro for the great moderation and all the logistics behind this. And thank all any of you, but also end with like a invitation. Professor Aurora Vergara, Professor Joseph Aritza, that is here also, epidemiologist, professor in Colombia, and Professor Wooten, Professor Kimari, Professor Souza. I think we could at least put together the name. You saw that some we displayed some organizations that have a campaign there in the local level. As Professor Wooten, I say, people are mobilized, but I also think that we could give a voice to amplify this voice to the globe. So maybe we can together bring the Mathare Center, bring Professor Wooten agenda, he grounded in the region, Professor Vergara in Cali, Professor Souza in Salvador. We could just map some organizations like the ones that we showed there and then have like a portfolio to spread through different networks that people can maybe, at this moment, you have to put the hand in your pocket and do something. $1, $2, anything is important at this moment, because there is when intellectual labor also meet the brutal reality. So maybe we should just put together this that may be simple. Maybe Dr. Wooten, you can put in our website in Black Study here, and colleagues can put in the website, and we unite efforts that people can give make the donation to wherever they want, to Kenya, to Colombia, to Brazil, but then we have a collective effort. Would that sounds good?
Sounds
Excellent.
great. Thank you very much. So we end here. Mark suggested that we create a mailing list out of this forum. So I would like to ask you all really quick, you can just send me a private message if you want through chat here. Just send me your email if you want, and I'll be in charge of creating a mailing list, and then we can exchange some material, some feedback, some ideas. So if you want, just please send me a private message with your email, and I'll make sure to create that, and then we can always stay in touch. Thank you all so much for being here. I think just adding on what everybody said, I think from now on, we have to just think and work on how to make it happen, to work together. So my question to you all is, what's next? What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do yourself? What are you gonna do with your community? So what's your homework? So think and act, and we're gonna be here if you have any questions. If you wanna talk, just get in touch with us. You all please take care and be safe.